As usual, another great guest, but a quick diversion. You'll notice that our full name is the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. Well, let's talk about your health for a moment. If you'd like to escape from the stranglehold of insurance and be able to see alternative doctors or go across state lines for care, then you definitely need to take a look at patientempowerment.mpb.health and see if that's the fix you've been looking for. Now, let's get back to the show.
Welcome, folks, to Freedom Hub's weekly health, business, and politics webinar. I'm Charlie Froman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Jim Graypeck. And over the past couple of years during the COVID hysteria, we've had a lot of leaders, entrepreneurs, medical personnel, all types, give their expertise in what's going on around the hysteria. And one lawyer and Ph.D. doctor that we've all wanted to hear from for a long time is David Martin, a fellow at the Darden School of Business at University of Virginia. He's also the CEO of MCAM International, and he can tell us what that's all about. But what really caught our attention from him so long ago was his statement, look for the patents, cui bono, who benefits, and let's really find the contracts behind the hysteria so we could figure out who the perps are. There's plenty of lawyers pursuing legal cases, but we don't see much happening in Congress with oversight or prosecutions, but that will have to happen, especially as we watch Wall Street people like Edward Dowd and other experts talk about the excess death that insurers now are reporting from last year, an excess death that only could happen from the vaccines. So David was featured in a documentary produced by our co-host, Jim Graypeck, called Planet Lockdown. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jim, to finish up the intro, and then we'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Charles. Actually co-produced. And I just want to say, let me get my notes out, to thank you, David, for what you're doing. Not just helping really bring the evidence out to hold these criminals accountable, but also working to help activate humanity as the co-host of that project, as well as other things. And we really need to come together now to create new systems and new communities that are going to replace these failed ones. Communities based around core values such as love, transparency, integrity, positive ethics, personal responsibility. A lot of us, I'm sure you're in there, see a silver lining to all this, and that is that this web of lies and deceit has been going on for a long time. And with all of the revelations coming forward, and the true nature of these criminals being exposed, maybe at last we can bring this endemic corruption to an end. With the right foundation in place, a foundation that you and all of your Freedom Hub family have been really building, we can move into a new era and live healthier, more fulfilling, more authentic, and self-actuated lives than ever before. So again, thank you for your great work, and take it away.
Thank you, Jim and Charles, and it's lovely to be here with all of you today. And I will forego the slides. I think it's much more interesting when we have a group to have an interactive session. I'll just give a little bit of background to give context for where my voice comes in all of this conversation. For the decade of the 90s, I ran Mosaic Technologies, which was a treaty-restricted technology transfer company. Our goal then was to find ways to take technologies that had been developed for defense purposes and find civilian opportunities with those technologies to ultimately allow them to be exported under the rules that were put in place at the end of the Second World War, which prohibited offensive military technology exports from a lot of countries, including most of Eastern Europe, obviously Japan, Germany, and other locations. And as the Soviet Union was falling apart, my job very explicitly was to look at technical capabilities that had civilian applications and find ways to export them. So everything from X-band radar absorption for anechoic use, as well as for shaping reflectant fields for RFID and other radio signatures, to gamma cameras for interventional radiology, to a whole host of other things, to a lot of work on using I-125 and other radioactive isotopes for biological applications in diagnostics. Mosaic Technologies was a very unique platform which got us access into over 120 countries and worked very closely in the field of defense-funded research and development, which ultimately landed me in a very unusual position of having a direct access to a lot of things that actually colored on the edge of or crossed the line of biological and chemical weapons regulation violations around the world. It was in 1999, after MCAM International was put in place. And for those of you not familiar with MCAM, our business was, as it is, we are the underwriter for intangible assets in commerce worldwide. Our job is to look at the creditworthiness of intangible assets for regulatory capital purposes, as well as for market purposes. I'm the creator of and still operate 3 IOSCO standard indexes, which are the top performing large cap equity indexes in the world. Have been doing that for nearly the past decade now. And one of the things that we have inside of our organization is a linguistic genomics platform, which allows us to collect data from 168 countries, underwrite all of the intangible asset transactions that take place. And our databases go back to 1786 and are comprehensive across every cross-border transaction from 1780s until the present. And that gives us a very unique set of perspectives. It was in the late 1990s that we began producing a series of documents with the green screen. It's a little difficult to see, but this is an example of one that if I hold it the right angle, you can see it. This is an annual publication that we do, which is a catalog of all biological and chemical weapons violations worldwide, who's doing it, who's funding it, what's being done, what's advancing. And we monitor all the 74 active toxins, which are recognized by international conventions, as well as United States civil regulations on what constitutes biological and chemical weapons targets. We monitor those under the Federal Select Agent Program and have been doing that since 1999, but publishing that since 2002. It was in 1999 that we saw that coronavirus manipulation, specifically the adaptation of the spike protein to target the epithelial cells in lungs, as well as the endothelial cells in myocardial tissue, was a quite alarming development that was patented out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, funded by NIAID's Anthony Fauci, who was specifically interested in looking at coronavirus spike protein as a dynamic active agent for the possibility of using coronavirus as a vaccine vector for HIV. The patent on the modification of recombinant coronavirus that was filed in 2002, a year before the first SARS outbreak, filed by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and developed on the back of NIH and NIAID funded grants, was for an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. And those terms are extremely important. Infectious and replication defective means that there was an amplification of the infectivity of the virus so that it had an ability to invade the cells more effectively. Replication defective, meaning that it was not as transmissible once it was entered into a specific population. So the idea was to create a platform which was able to be used for technology purposes, not for public health purposes or otherwise. And that's a very important distinction, because the bioweaponization of coronavirus, which actually was patented by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2002, was actually a precursor, as you all know, to the 2003 SARS outbreak, and subsequent to that, to the multiple alterations that have happened since. In the very small amount of time that I'm going to have just to highlight a few key elements of our conversation before we open it up for Q&A, it's important to realize that as we have a express engineering of coronavirus for the purpose of increasing infectivity to human cells. By 2002, in the wake of, obviously, all of you remember September 2001, the anthrax outbreak, the revolution of liability to corporations was extended through what became ultimately in 2005, the PrEP Act, which was a way to get immunity liability shields to pharmaceutical companies where they could actually develop technologies, including what they would purport to represent to be vaccines, and have an absolute immunity shield for any product liability emerging from their corrupt practices. That program, put in motion in September of 2001 and enshrined in the law in the PrEP Act in 2005, was the crowning achievement of the beginning of the racketeering efforts undertaken by NIAID, by Anthony Fauci, by Moderna, as it was being formed. If you recall back then, 2005, that predates Moderna by 5 years. But what we saw was the NSF grant, which was the Darwinian Chemical Systems grant, specifically focused on the manipulation of mRNA so that we could actually build mechanisms to allow mRNA to write into and transcribe into DNA. Those efforts ultimately culminated in 2010 and 2011 in the formation of a criminal conspiracy, a racketeering criminal conspiracy, where the public sector regulatory capture of NIH, NIAID, CDC, and FDA were complete, such that we could start using the CDC's SARS coronavirus patent that they filed in 2003, April of 2003. We could use the vaccine platform patents that were filed by Sequoia Pharmaceuticals 2 days after the patenting of the SARS coronavirus in 2003. We could combine all of those, and between Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, we could build a platform which would allow for the development of Anthony Fauci's obsession of a universal vaccine acceptance. In 2011, this came to a crescendo in a public document, which was the World Health Organization's Decade of the Vaccine document, in which they stated by September of 2020, the goal was to make sure that vaccination of every human being on the planet was a, quote, human right. And that this, quote, exercise of a human right, end quote, would actually lead to population control with Bill Gates's target of a 15% population reduction, or the reduction of 800 million people off the face of the earth. That objective was published in 2011, recapitulated in 2013, and not surprisingly, in 2013, the gift that keeps on giving showed up, which was the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1, or WIV1, which was one of the contributing variables that actually led to the creation of the moratorium on gain-of-function research, because it became very clear that coronavirus, being one of the most malleable viral models, was something that was being manipulated for a whole bunch of reasons. Back in 2005, Ralph Barrick was famously quoted in saying that coronavirus had both biodefense applications for a bioweapon as well as for potential countermeasures to bioweapons, but coronavirus was selected as the agent most malleable and most capable of manipulation for ultimately achieving the objectives of the 2011 publication. In 2013, we see the Wuhan Institute of Virology Virus 1 segregated. We see it replicated in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And then, not surprisingly, in October of 2014, when the moratorium was put in place, there was a very bizarre letter shared between NIAID and UNC Chapel Hill, which stated that the in vivo testing of recombinant coronavirus was the subject of the gain-of-function moratorium, but for reasons that have never been explained in public, UNC Chapel Hill was authorized to continue its gain-of-function research on SARS coronavirus while the rest of the world was subject to a moratorium. Now, if we ask the question, well, why would that be the case? If there's a moratorium, the classic construction of the language moratorium suggests that there is an interruption and possibly a permanent interruption of a thing. what we noticed was that beginning in 2014 and moving through 2016, there was a concerted effort to make coronavirus the crowning jewel in the crown of Anthony Fauci's objective for the universal vaccine mandate. And that crowning achievement was first articulated in 2015 by Peter Daszak, the gentleman who was responsible for EcoHealth Alliance, and at the time was laundering funds between NIAID and the CDC of China, as well as other institutions in America and China. And he famously stated, which I love to quote, just because for those of you who sit on the fence of whether or not this was premeditated racketeering and domestic terrorism, I'd like to dispel that rumor once and for all. The quote is, "To sustain the funding base beyond the current crisis, we need to increase the public understanding of the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics will follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of the process," end quote. That is an admission of domestic terrorism. That is an admission of racketeering. That is an admission of 8 felony violations of US law. And to date, there has not been a single effort to prosecute that by anyone in any jurisdiction whatsoever, which is one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice, because this was outright admission of racketeering, domestic terrorism, sedition, interlocking directorates, lying to Congress, funding and creating biological weapons, etc. It was in 2016 when the paper that was published by UNC Chapel Hill, which said that SARS coronavirus was, quote, "poised for human emergence," was actually the declaration of war on humanity, which actually is the thing we have now lived through over the last 2+ years. And tragically, through all of this, what has happened is we have lost sight of the fact that since 1604, since the establishment of the British East India Company, we have had an economy that has been based largely on the economics of the fear of death. And that economic model has been delivered to us by the industrial, pharmaceutical, criminal, conspiratorial, racketeering cabal. And it is that institution which has now acquired control of our legislative as well as our judicial system, which presents the massive problem that we're living in right now, which gives rise to the actions that we have recently taken after exhausting all of our requests for criminal actions to be taken seriously by district attorneys, by US attorneys, and by attorneys general in all 50 states, where not a single one of them has been willing to prosecute the self-evident crimes that are admitted to in writing by the perpetrators. We filed on the 3rd of March in the state of Utah, in the Federal District of Utah. We filed the first of a series of actions which are focused on, first of all, declaring that the injection that is being proposed as a vaccination does not meet the legal or the biologic or the medical definition of a vaccination. As a matter of fact, the term defined by the 1986 Act, which is the last time there has been a statutory definition of what a vaccine is an act that has not been amended since then, which means all of CDC's definitional changes throughout the last two years have been interesting only in that they are trying to evade the law, because the law actually stipulates what a vaccine is. And what we're doing is seeking the declaration that this is neither a vaccine. This is actually, as stated by the FDA and as stated in SEC filings by all of the companies manufacturing the mRNA injections, this is a gene therapy with a sole function of systematic symptom reduction, not necessarily, and in no instance, established to be a disruptor of either infection or transmission. But then more egregiously, what we point out is the manipulation of police powers, which is something which is also a current hijack of our judicial system, which in fact is a very interesting thing to unpack, because what we have in public health law is the ability for states to take action when they can disrupt infection or transmission of an epidemic or an epidemic agent. The problem, obviously, in the mRNA injection is that no infection or transmission disruption is even a clinical endpoint for the clinical trials. This has been nothing more than individual symptom reduction, which means that this has fallen outside the realm of state police powers. And as such, every state declaration that has been made, and by that I mean every single one of them, has been an act of sedition. It has not been an act of public health. And it turns out the reason why we filed in Utah is because it's critical for us to put into motion a set of legal proceedings which force the government in their response to admit to felony crimes in the state of Utah, which is the reason why we chose that jurisdiction. Without unpacking all the details of that, I can confidently say that there was only one state where we could actually file a case where the admission in defense that the United States government will offer to defend against the case will be an affirmative admission of felonies. And in the state of Utah, there is one very distinct clause which actually puts the enforcement of an action as an obligation, not as an elective decision of the Attorney General. So the great news is we have actually put in motion a case which will begin the felony unraveling of the current situation. But to take that one step further, and obviously the heart and soul of what I care about is to recognize that, as we just discussed and as Jim alluded to in his opening comments, my personal objective and our corporate objective is to blow up a much bigger paradigm, and that is an economic system that is fueled by the fear of death. Our goal, obviously, is to see that system eradicated and replaced by systems that are aligned to life and humanity. And so what we're doing is a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, our goal is to hold the current system accountable, but we are also actively pursuing a series of steps that allow us to build systems that have a fundamental foundational change, which says that rather than the arbitrage of the actuarial expectancy of how broken, damaged, and deadly our world is, we're aligning an economic system that is aligned to health and vitality. And that system is something that we're actively constructing right now. So we're kind of looking at the strategy at the broad level and the tactics at the micro level, and putting energy into both of those prongs so that as we see the system that has been incumbent for the last 420 years, as we see that system collapse, we're actually working to make sure that there are strategic and credible alternatives that we can deploy. So with that, Jim and Charles, I will end my 16 minutes and take questions.
Great talk. Wow. And concise. You hit all the notes there.
Well, I like to make sure that we can have the creativity of brilliant minds who are on this call rather than the recitation of the material that is available in a number of different formats in my world. For those of you wanting any of the documentation, the easiest place to find it is at prosecutenow.com. And if you go to prosecutenow.com, you can access all of the cases. You can access a summary of criminal investigation as well as the draft criminal indictment for the 8 felony counts. So I'm ready to take questions, Charles, Jim, or whoever else.
Excellent.
Yep.
Let me ask a first question before Joe does, our brilliant marketer. David, on the lack of prosecutorial effort to deal with the domestic terrorism, do you have any hope with Republicans' probable takeover this November that they'll, through oversight hearings, advance some of this dynamic of making the perps pay?
No, not really. And that's an unfortunate conclusion, but let me just share the following observation. Both sides of the aisle are purchased by pharma, and pharma is the official brand pharma. So I'm not using that metaphorically. I'm talking about the lobbying industry association pharma. And the fact of the matter is, what we have found is that even the most conservative and outspoken critics of the current campaign, people like, Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, people like Rand Paul and others, unfortunately refused to challenge the incumbency of the 2005 PrEP Act or the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Immunizations Act. None of them are willing to take on pharma at a fundamental level, Charles. So the problem is that if we actually had genuine prosecutorial investigations, what we would find is that all roads lead back to compromised public officials, including the very ones that are currently being celebrated as most outspoken. It's not by accident that in January, Ron Johnson, when he was convening his panel right after the Bobby Kennedy march on the National Mall, made abundantly clear in his preamble statement of his roundtable gathering that everyone sitting around the table, and let's review for the record who was sitting around that table. Several of the physicians who are heralded by the quote, kind of COVID informed, several of those physicians were sitting around the table. Several of the lawyers who were associated with that were sitting around the table. And Ron Johnson said, all of us support vaccinations generally, and all of us support the COVID vaccination. What we are opposed to is the mandate. Now, here's the tiny little problem. If any person at that table did not raise their hand and say, excuse me, Senator, I don't have an ability to sit idly by when you make a statement like that, then we know that even the most aggressive member of the Senate is compromised. When Rand Paul has sat now for 4 different interactions with Anthony Fauci, sitting across the table in cross-examination under oath with the penalty of perjury, 18 U.S. Code Section 1001 in his face, when Rand Paul fails to deliver to Anthony Fauci the written documentation I put in his hands, which was the written documentation of the October 2014 memo that says that Ralph Barrick's research at UNC Chapel Hill was gain of function, and it says it on NIAID letterhead. And Rand Paul refuses to deliver that knockout blow 4 times. What we know is that there is no oversight. We know there is theater. We know there is theater of the emasculated, because right now the Republicans can say all they want. And unfortunately, not a single one of them is standing up for integrity. Not one. So if we have Republicans somehow taking control of the House and more interest in the Senate going into the 2022 electoral cycle, I have no confidence whatsoever that there is any accountability forthcoming, which is the reason why what we're doing is we are in the business of making sure that the public admission of criminal statutes goes into court proceedings in a location where a affirmative defense for the actions that we allege in our federal case will be an admission of felony crimes that are required to be prosecuted in Utah, and only in Utah. That's the only state where this happens. So, Charles, that's probably a depressing thing to say, but it's unfortunately the reality.
I have a follow-up, but Marketer Joe, go ahead.
Hey, Dr. David. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to ask you questions here. What you talk about Trump signing an executive order kind of
Correct.
Before all of this happened. So do you see him also as, completely part of the problem?
Yes,
or do you see
without
the
question.
Theater, do you see the theater and devolution as something that's potentially in play as well?
No. Listen, on September 19th, when President Donald Trump signed what effectively is the Operation Warp Speed executive order, there is no justification in any rational worldview to have that executive order signed. There was no public health emergency. The only EUA at the time, if you go back, Joe, and recall, the only EUA active at the time was the opioid crisis. And so obviously there's no emergency need for a DNA-based vaccine program for the opioid crisis, even though it's worth noting Moderna has a patent on a injection for vaccination for opioid addiction. If you want to, seriously, what I just said almost makes your mind spin out of its orbit, but that is in fact the case. Moderna has a vaccine for opioid addiction. But the idea that there was an urgent need on the 19th of September of 2019 for President Trump to sign an executive order stipulating the formation of vaccines based on DNA and cDNA modification are beyond the pale. And when you see the December explanation of that in the first week of December, when Anthony Fauci gets up and says that the president was mandating mRNA injections to be developed a month before patient one, allegedly in Wuhan, you have to recognize that this was not some sort of caught up in, the innocence of ignorance. This was a willful act where the sedition that was going on was actually something in which his defense can only be ignorance. And I got a bad piece of news for you. When it comes to felony crimes, ignorance is not, and nor has it ever been, a defense. You cannot claim ignorance as a defense for felony acts. And the felony acts of premeditated, willful, reckless homicide and or murder of humans, the willful act of domestic terrorism, the willful act of antitrust collusion, where Alex Azar, the Department of Health and Human Services actual director at the time, was not only under investigation for racketeering, but he had already been found complicit in racketeering, where he had done price fixing in the sale by Lilly of diabetes drugs to Mexico. This guy was already under criminal investigation for racketeering. He's the one who's putting the document in front of Trump on September 19th. And you can sit back and say, well, maybe Trump was just ignorant. Maybe he was one too many Big Macs into, breakfast. But the fact of the matter is, you cannot hide behind the fact that Donald Trump willfully participated in a criminal conspiracy, and as such has zero likelihood of being part of the solution.
Do you think that's part of John Durham's and the bigger investigation of these 100,000 plus federal indictments potentially?
Well, quite possibly. But the fact of the matter is, right now, one of the things I was advised by several cycles ago, the former attorney general here in Virginia, Ken Cuccinelli, Ken said that I am kryptonite to attorneys general. And I said, well, what does that mean? He goes, well, everywhere you go, all of the blackmail people have on them show up. Like, seriously, within an hour, I was supposed to meet with Ken Paxton in Texas. An hour into my scheduled meeting time, an hour before that, he was served with 6 felony counts of SEC violations. I was supposed to meet with the Attorney General Sean Reyes in Utah. An hour before my meeting, allegedly he and his staff came down with COVID. And then a day or two later, there were alleged videos that surfaced about Sean Reyes at a party with prostitutes and with cocaine and with a bunch of other things. Seriously, when I get a scheduled meeting, somehow mysteriously, whatever dirt somebody has on the person with whom the meeting is scheduled always shows up. So the fact of the matter is, we're living in a period of time where we simply do not have people in positions of public accountability who are not compromised. And I lay that out both as a critique and a challenge. If there is a single elected official who actually is not uncompromised, the offer is I will travel anywhere, meet with anyone at any time, and begin the criminal prosecutions that should happen. But between now and then, I'm quite confident in saying that there has to date been not a single person with the integrity to prosecute the admitted and self-evident crimes that are prima facie felony violations.
David, I'm in line next. You had some great presentations on YouTube or Rumble over the past month or so, naming from the contracts who's really going to be liable for the lawsuits once they're allowed to happen, including contract with Answer that would be liable, not the actual pharma companies below them. Before Alex, you're next. Do you want to kind of briefly touch on that series of speeches, who you found through the contracts is really liable?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing. And Charles, I'm glad you bring it up because this was premeditated to include what Johnson & Johnson is now doing. And for those of you who have any questions about this, Johnson & Johnson is now bankrupting themselves for all of the liabilities that we know come out of the talcum powder dispute and everything else. Essentially, what they're doing is shifting the liability a la the Sackler family, where the Sackler family kept their wealth, moved the opioid liability to a special purpose vehicle, and they're ultimately hiding behind that. In two presentations, and if you want to look these up, Charles, they're the Red Pill Expo in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is where I did a enormous amount of disclosure of the individuals responsible for this. And then the Weston Price Foundation annual meeting outside of Dallas, Texas, where I laid out, Charles, to your point, the subcontractors and the prime contractors who actually hold the current liability. The fact of the matter is Operation Warp Speed and all the derivatives of Operation Warp Speed, which means all the mRNA injections, go through a Defense Department Black Ops shell corporation, ATI. And ATI is a subsidiary corporation that operates in South Carolina. Its business is government propaganda for the Department of Defense. It also has uniquely one pharmaceutical application, and the one pharmaceutical application is Operation Warp Speed. Beyond that, they are nothing more than a Defense Department contractor for propaganda dissemination. Ironic that they were chosen as the head of Operation Warp Speed. Go figure. I'll let you draw your own conclusions because I'm not supposed to make the self-evident conclusion that derives from what I just said. But they are a holding company owned by and acquired recently by Answer. And Answer is a black ops corporation, which is another shell corporation for both intelligence and Defense Department applications, ANSER, a company that has been the shadow organization through which an enormous number of federal contracts are run, largely anonymously, where like SAIC, like CACI, and like several others, what we have is a series of black or gray contracts, Charles, that do not have transparency and are set up specifically to shield the corporations doing the dirty work from liability, because the actual claim for Answer and ATI is going to be a dual Department of Justice and a very interesting determination that came out of the JAG, which is the Judge Advocate General legal infrastructure in the Department of Defense, where essentially there is a dual opinion on the culpability of the Department of Defense for injuries and death resulting from the injections. And these determinations were made in April of 2020, before there was any mRNA vaccine, before there was any mRNA injection. The determination of liability immunity was already afforded pre-injection to the Department of Defense. And there are two, not one, but two DOJ and JAG opinions to that effect. You only would have gotten those opinions if you knew there was a liability. And the only reason why that opinion is delivered to ATI and to Answer is because ultimately, when there is a class action on damages, this will be a bankrupt organization that will hold 100% of the financial liability, shielding the manufacturers from their illegal acts because they were acting as a subcontractor, insured by those opinions. So that's where the problem is. And ATI and Answer are going to one day be the scapegoats that we actually see hold the liability. They'll be bankrupt and no one will get any claim. Alex.
Hey, Dr. Martin, thank you very much. And on the subject of liability, I have one question that pertains to that. And I just shared a petition. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, because really my question is, what do you think is the most efficient way to restore civil suit liability back onto the vaccine makers? And so I have a petition here I can go into detail about that. But that's my first question. And then I recently interviewed Foster Gamble. He shared how he had been collaborating with you and connected with you a long time ago. I'm wondering kind of how you see the whole Thrive narrative kind of somewhat synergizing with like what we're talking about to overall have, you know, prosperity for as many humans and for as much sentient life here on Earth as possible.
Alex, two great questions. First of all, the elimination of corporate shields of liability should be a very top priority in the direct consequence of the actions that have just taken over the last 2 years. So any effort that is to blow that up, I am not only very strongly in favor of, but I would do a lot to help support. So that's, you know, part one. But part two, and something that Foster and I have spent a lot of time talking about, and we continue to spend a lot of time collaborating on, in fact, we're doing a lot more recently, is we actually have, and this goes back to my 1604 metaphor that I mentioned during my preliminary contacts. The fact of the matter is, as long as we allow limited liability corporations or any liability shield to inure to the benefit of a corporate entity, we have a fundamental problem. Because the fact is that if any of us were actively pursuing a campaign which resulted in 30,000 people killed, we would actually be, you know, tried for all sorts of felony crimes. But when that's done by NIH or when it's done by NIAID or when it's done as an HIV clinical trial for, you know, Anthony Fauci, we don't mind. 30,000 people dead just doesn't matter. And that's not an acceptable thing for humanity to experience. So one of the things that Foster and I are talking about is actually returning to a world in which every action for which any of us take any responsibility is something for which we also bear responsibility and culpability. The fact of the matter is, if we are held accountable, we will make better decisions. And if we know we can act with impunity, we will make bad decisions. The evidence of 8,000 years of documented human history is very clear on that. And so this is not a giant open question like, I wonder how it's going to work out. We know how it's going to work out. And one of the things that Foster and I have embraced very heavily in our actions is to say that as we think about particularly some of the efforts that he and Kimberly have taken under the kind of Thrive 2 and beyond, is that we need to make sure that people have basic accountability such that you are responsible for the things you do, the words you say, the actions you take, and you bear that responsibility in a form that says that you cannot hide behind the fact that, oh, it was a corporation doing the action, so therefore everything's fine. I'm glad you asked that question because it's really critical to understand that unless we get the business model of business correct, then what we'll do is supplant one carnal narrative for another. And at the end of the day, we will not have made any progress. So I really appreciate your question. I'm glad that you raised that. That's great. I have, I don't know the first name, but Glazer is up.
Yes. Hi. Thank
Hello.
you so much for speaking today. That's really interesting to hear about Thrive. Thrive talks about the solution, and I think people resonate with it.
Yeah.
And I'd love to be in a situation where we're living in that world where we get to debate these fun solutions. I think it'd be wonderful.
Yeah.
My question is along those same lines with regard to transparency. I'd like to know your thoughts on how you see transparency fitting into the solution in the future. And if you like, I could give an example.
Well, so that's a topic I've spoken about quite a bit, and I'm glad that you bring that up too. I think that you cannot have democracy without absolute transparency. I think you cannot have civil order without absolute transparency. One of the things that I made a commitment to when I started doing our weekly broadcasts, my wife and I started those weekly broadcasts 2 years ago this week, is to make sure that every time we make a statement, we have the evidence for that statement that is publicly available. And the reason why is not because I'm trying to prove a point. The reason why is because I'm trying to model a way of living. And the way of living is to be precise on when I'm offering my opinion. And I make it very clear when it's my opinion, I share my opinion. And when I'm actually trying to disseminate information, I want to make sure that my conclusions are something that somebody can go and independently verify. So I'm really grateful that you bring this up, because in addition to all of those things, I did one other thing, which was very unique to our instance alone, which is after we hit our 300th interview, I went back and listened to all of them. And I compiled a show that we did on the Butterfly of the Week. I compiled a show of every error that I had stated. Something simple like I said the Global Monitoring Preparedness Board instead of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, right? When I transposed a word, when I used an acronym where I said NIAID or NAID or whatever, if I misspoke, we did an entire show on my errors. And we did it to show that there's no harm in having errors. You don't lose credibility. You don't lose reputation. You don't become any less of anything by holding yourself to the standard that says, not only am I proud of the work that I've done and the things that I've said, but I'm proud of the fact that I can tell you that I screwed up. Right? Transparency is not just ethics. It's not just embracing a sense of the best of us. It's actually going one step further and modeling a behavior that says you are not less if you hold yourself to a higher standard. And so I'm absolutely embracing the idea of transparency and accountability, because it is only then that we can meaningfully have an engagement around the future and what the future might look like in a democratic system that serves humanity. Thank you for bringing that up. Frank.
David, do you think a couple of questions. Do you think the system in Canada is as corrupt as it is in the United States?
Yes.
And so that being the case, I've noticed that you have all these materials on Trudeau.
Yeah.
And his connection with the research. How can we access this? Because I was talking to a member of parliament and they're very interested in pursuing it. I don't know how far that's going to go, but if we want to get our hands on that, what will we do?
Yeah, Randy Hillier and I, he's an MEP from Ontario.
Yes.
Randy and I have been in conversations. One of the things that I tried to point out was that Trudeau was the one that came to the public for at the very beginning, saying that there was no way out but for what he called a vaccine. And what was alarming about that was that both Moderna and Pfizer relied on University of British Columbia technology, the lipid nanoparticle technology, as the only enabling delivery mechanism to actually inject mRNA into the human being. So the notion that not only would Canada benefit directly financially from both campaigns, it didn't matter who won because they won on both sides, but they financially participated in what was absolutely a racketeering campaign. Because Frank, if you go back and look at Canada's purchase of what they called vaccines, there were more vaccines purchased than there were for all Canadians plus Moose combined.
That's right.
Now, that's money laundering. That's pure and simple money laundering. You cannot come up with a rationale that said there was a population reason for the purchased number of injections, except for the fact that they knew that they were paying themselves. And by inflating the numbers of injections purchased by Canada, and if you go back and look, Canada has not come up with an explanation for why they needed more injections than there were Canadians plus Moose. You have to conclude that this was actually part of a price-fixing, racketeering manipulation of the market. Those are all things that are self-evident. But Frank, there's a less transparent question. And this is a less transparent question because Acuitas Pharmaceuticals several years ago was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was really one guy in his office maintaining what was effectively a misappropriated trade secret. And if you go back and look at the provenance of what happened with that University of British Columbia technology, what you'll see is Arbutus and Acuitas have been at each other's throats for the last several years on who owns what rights. And that's been a very public dispute. The Supreme Court of British Columbia is filled with evidence that I've encouraged members of parliament to enter into the record. It is in the Supreme Court of British Columbia, which is where all the evidence is living. And what needs to happen is that the parliament needs to take that evidence and put it into the parliament. It's not hard. I read those records from here. Anybody can read them from Canada too. It's easier to do in Canada. So far, not a single member of parliament has even examined those records and put them into any public disclosure, which I find hideously offensive. But here's the beginning of your question. The Commonwealth Corporation, as an institution, is the agency of the corruption we're talking about. So the reason why I say Canada is equally or more corrupt than we are in the US, and by the way, corruption, when we're talking on the scale that we're talking, is literally irrelevantly a question of magnitude. The US is violently corrupt in its legal and its legislative systems. Canada is horribly corrupt, and worse, it's a puppet that acts as a theater stage upon which the Commonwealth Corporation has done all sorts of manipulations of market. The reason why the Toronto Stock Exchange exists is for illicit operators who cannot handle transparency to have a liquid market access. It's organized crime, and they know it, and it's admitted to. So the fact of the matter is, we can sit back and pretend like, well, you know, the maple leaf and maple syrup somehow makes you a little nicer, and saying A at the end of a sentence somehow is just charming. But the fact of the matter is, Canada has been a criminal conspiracy racket for many, many years. Since the Hudson Bay Corporation took over in 1815, there is no question that Canada has been a front for criminal activities for the Crown Corporation, and it still is to this day. So once again, kind of bad news. But the answers for the members of parliament is they need to read the British Columbia Supreme Court records on the trade secret dispute between Arbutus and Acuitas Pharmaceuticals, and all of the information is there. The last thing I'll say is there is a very bizarre $150 million Canadian dollar grant that was given by Parliament to the Trudeau Foundation. There is no explanation for what justified that grant. But that grant is the one which I've said on numerous occasions, if I was going to lead an investigation in Canada, I would start with that. Why did Parliament take $150 million of Canadian funds and give it to the Trudeau Family Foundation? Because part of that money went to what was considered to be state-of-the-art and biotechnology and advanced technology companies, but they never disclosed who the recipients were. It turns out, and this is just anecdotal, I'm not making an accusation because I do not have the evidence, but it turns out that along the same timeline that that grant was made, Acuitas announced that it suddenly had a massive undisclosed donation coming in to its capital structure. Now, I'm not saying that's cause and effect. I'm simply saying that where I smell a rotten fish, I look for rotten fish. And I would start there because it smells of rotten fish. Whoever the owner is, I don't know who owner is, but I know your color is teal.
Okay, I'm Lori Timmerman, and I'm here in Western North Carolina, Asheville, part of 4 different health freedom groups. So quite a number of us have submitted the proposed indictment to our district attorneys.
Yes.
I did both in person and through the mail. I'm looking for another target, which what I learned is in North Carolina, they have regional offices, and
Yes.
the office for Western North Carolina is here in Asheville. So any advice about serving the assistant attorney generals here with that dossier?
Yes.
And another target I've thought of is in the Senate with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, because he's a former attorney general.
Yes.
And he's written the book, captured how corporations have infiltrated our document.
Yeah.
So
So beautiful question. And what I would say is that the purpose of having people send the draft indictment was to put people on the record. One of the things that we needed to do was build out an enormous amount of evidence that said that law enforcement was not taking action. That's actually an evidentiary basis. So first of all, thank you for sending it in. Second of all, thank you for preserving a record of it and sharing it on this platform and others. So thank you for doing that. What we are doing in prosecutenow.com is we are now building an evidence base, which is going to be where we're going to ask for responses or the lack thereof from district attorneys, U.S. attorneys, and AGs. The reason for that is that we are actually forming a class of a sedition case, which is actually a very interesting case, which shows that law enforcement not only was willfully acting in ignorance, but was participating in an act of domestic terrorism, which brings rise to sedition claims against those officials. So what we will do, and what I would ask of you, is to keep informing us at prosecutenow.com of who you submitted this to, when, and we're actually going to start a campaign to collect these things. So this is just ahead of that by a few weeks. But we're going to ask for people to submit that information so that we have the ability to build the case, which is ultimately going to be 18 U.S. Code Section 2384, which is sedition. And we're going to build a case that includes elected officials, because it's important to have that done. And then subsequent to that, and by the way, I just need to let people know I've got another interview coming up in 3 minutes. So I'm going to jump to the last two questions really quickly, but prosecutenow.com is going to be where you want to stay on top of what to do next, because we're going to lay out those steps very shortly. Thank you. Dr. John Montalvo.
Yes, Dr. David Martin, pleasure meeting you, sir, in this format. I've heard you speak at many different conferences, and I know you have a ton of information that you've bestowed upon us. And I was wondering, did you ever have the opportunity to talk to Governor Ron DeSantis here in the state of Florida concerning the evidence that you have and how to pursue that evidence in order to prosecute somebody like Anthony Fauci? I've just been reading Bobby Kennedy's book and the type of murders that Fauci has committed, not just here in the United States, but also in Africa.
Yeah, John, I have been requested on now several occasions to speak with him. And every time I've been given that request, I've accommodated it only to find out that it gets canceled. I'm going down to Florida again on the 2nd of April. And I was told that I was going to have an opportunity to meet up with him again on the 2nd of April to review this material. And I was just recently advised that once again, his conflict makes our meeting impossible. So I don't know what the deal is. You know, I have all the evidence. I have now had AG's offices across the country review all the evidence. They agree with the felony assertions that are being made. And, you know, so far, nothing. So if you have any way to activate it, I'd be more than happy to try. I've been working very aggressively to try to support that. And, you know, we'll see where it goes. And Linda, I have to give you the last word because I've got to be on another interview in 1 minute.
Yes, thank you. After spending 20 hours in 2 days at a conference called Medicine and Justice, most of it was focused on digital medicine. I concluded that this COVID pandemic was part of a bigger plan.
Yes.
Like the implementation of 5G everywhere, even if in the sky, transhumanism, digitize everything. My question is, as so-called so far human and being, do I have the right to have health services without having a cell phone, apps, digital devices on my body or not? This is a revolution,
so Linda,
this is a reaction.
Yeah. So Linda, that's a great question. And the answer is at this point in time, regrettably, most of what we think of as rights are actually not defined. We have not defined what it means to have right of bodily integrity, and we do not have defined the right to access of a particular standard of care because of the privatization and the corporatization of our legal system. That is something that I strongly support, and I think that we should be actively reviewing that. So there is a right to life, a right to liberty, and a right to pursuit of happiness, not aspirationally saying that it's a good idea. I think we need to be putting those in as fundamental legal rights. At this point in time, that's not the case, but your question is spot on. And with that, Charles, Jim, and the whole lot of you, thank you for having me, and I will look forward to following up with you all later. Thank you.
So what about your wealth? If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? Well, with the DNA Network Academy, your money actually can talk to you, and it's going to tell you just what it told this client. This family had over 24 debts, mortgages, car loans, the works. They were on track to take 20 years to pay it all off, and instead did it in 8.5. Plus, they did it without refinancing, making more money, or even changing their lifestyle. So find out for yourself with a free analysis that is completely confidential. No personal information, no social security numbers, no credit checks, none of that nonsense. But what is exciting is that the outcome of that report you receive is a guaranteed outcome for you. To get that report, head on over to bit.ly/debt to wealth. You will arrive at this simple form. Fill it in as simple as lender number 1 and credit card number 2. What really matters is the accuracy of your numbers. You'll be able to see that if instead of 20 years or whatever your number is, that you may actually be out of debt and on your way to wealth in as little as 6.3 years like this client.